The new set mechanic are augments, and there are almost 150 of them. So if you wanted to know when to take each and every one of them and what comps they're good in, what champions they're good on, this is a guide for you, because I just went ahead and categorized every single augment, and I had a couple of categories. First off were the trait augments, second are some combat ones, next are some scaling ones, and then the last one are some of the econ or utility ones. For a lot of them, I also marked off whether they're good in the early game, mid game, and late game, because you get a choice of when to choose your specific augments. For example, you get them at rounds 1, 4, 3, 3, and 4, 6. But to make this a lot easier to understand, let's just go ahead and sort them by category. And starting at the top, we're going to be going over the combat augments. So these are the ones that power up your team right away. So you generally want to take these if your team is a little weak right now and you need a little bit of a boost. So if you see this option come up and you are wanting to go on a win streak, for example, these are perfect for you to take. So the first one we're going to go over is called Ascension. This one is a combat one, and the description is after 15 seconds of combat, your units deal 100% more damage. So obviously you want to take this on teams where you have very long fights. So a lot of the tankier units, such as Bodyguard and Syndicate, things of that nature. One thing to note, because early game fights tend to last longer, this is very good for win streaking in the early games. So in the early game, I'd probably give this a 5 out of 5, mid game 3 out of 3, and then late game 1 out of 5. Before we move on, all of these rankings that I have for all of these augments, they do assume that all the augments are actually balanced. So for example, they could change this 100% number to 200%, or they could change it to 10%. That would greatly affect the strength of the actual augment. But we can't control what happens from patch to patch. We can only control how strong they are, assuming that the game is balanced. Next one we have is Band of Thieves. This one just gives you 2 Thieves Gloves, and this is good if you have unitemized units who can use them pretty well. So typically in the early game, that's not going to be that great because you don't have many units. Mid game, probably decent, and then it probably gets better as the game goes on because you'll have random units with no items that can hold the Thieves Gloves later on. Binary Airdrop is the next one. And your units equipped with 2 items temporarily gain a random completed item at the start of combat. So this one needs a lot of planning, so it's a little tricky to use. Personally, for me, I think it is strongest in the mid game because that's the point where you don't actually have space for 3 items on your carry, but you do have enough units and items to kind of set up different units to take advantage of this trait. For example, in the early game, you're not going to have that many units affected, and in the late game, you want your carry to have 3 perfect items for him in order to absolutely dominate the game for you. Next up, we have Built Different. This one's a bit of a weird one. Your units with no active traits gain 200 health and 40% attack speed. And for this, you have to be a little careful because some legendaries, they have innate traits such as Yuumi and Jace, and those units have their own innate traits. Whether they change that interaction in the future or if they already fix it already, it would affect the usefulness of that specific unit on that team. But one unit that this is great on, personally, I think is Victor, because Victor is great right now at 2 items without actually having the Arcanist synergy active. So there are a couple of units who use this really well, and essentially you just want to use whoever you have 2-star and try to keep them with no active traits. I know that attack speed isn't the best on Victor, but it does help him cast faster, which allows him to dominate a lot of different teams. For this specific trait, and a lot of them share the same property, they have a tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, and this just changes based on what choices you get. Now you might be wondering, why would I ever take a tier 1 trait over a tier 3 trait? Well, they released a drop odds for how often something shows up, and they have silver, gold, prismatic. Silver is tier 1, gold is tier 2, and prismatic is tier 3, and they show here how often they drop based on what round you are in. So in the first choice of Hextech Augments, which is round 1-4, you have a 70% chance to get a tier 1, 25% chance to get a tier 2, and 5% chance to get a tier 3. And you guys can do the math yourselves on how they work out for the rest of the choices here. But essentially, everyone in the same game gets the same tier of choices. The exact augments will be different, but if you get a tier 1 trait, all 3 of your choices will be tier 1, and so will all of your opponents. So no one's going to get quite an unfair advantage in that sort of sense. So next one we have up is Celestial Blessing. This one's also a 1, 2, 3. And this one heals your units for a little bit of the damage that they deal with attacks and abilities. And then also excess healing is converted into a shield up to a certain health threshold depending on what level you are. So this is great whenever you have a carry with 3 damage items. It's also pretty good early game because early game life regen is really, really useful because the fights last so long. But late game, I typically like it as well because, again, you're going to have 3 damage items. For example, if you have a Jhin, you could put stuff like Infinity Edge, Last Whisper, and Giant Slayer, and you don't really need to fit in like a Bloodthirster or a Hand of Justice on him in order to get healing. Next up, we have Cybernetic Implants. I'm glad that they brought this one back because I always thought Cybernetics was really, really cool, but units equipped with an item gain a bunch of health and attack damage. So this is great in a lot of attack damage comps and great if you have utility items to spread out. For example, if you have a lot of Zephyrs, if you have a lot of like Zeke's Heralds or other aura items, it's going to be great because you are going to be able to spread these items out and really take advantage of the buff that this augment gives. Reason why it's not great on certain comps such as like, let's say Challengers where you have 3 items on Yone, 3 items on Fiora, is because it's only going to buff 2 units. Not that this buff is bad on them because they love attack damage and they love health, but it's just not going to be as good as a comp where maybe you only have 1 carry with 3 items and then you just kind of put 1 item on everyone else in order to make use of this cybernetic implant. I personally like this a lot early game because you could put item components on everyone and not commit to a certain team comp without sacrificing the power of not having completed items in the early part of the game, because oftentimes in the early game we get 3 item components and we typically field either 3 to 5 units during all of stage 2, and you could just drop 1 component on each of your guys and they get a bunch of health and attack damage, which should theoretically help you win streak without sacrificing your late game because you can customize your items. Next up, we have the Exiles, and this one is really interesting as well because it gives you free tankiness, and it's good if you can afford to split up your team. So what this does is at the start of combat, if your units start with no adjacent allies next to them, you gain a 40% maximum health shield at tier 1, 60, and 80% at tiers 2 and 3. And as you guys can imagine, this is really good when you're able to spread out your units. So as the game goes on, you'll have more units. It's going to be a little more complicated to kind of spread everyone out. So I do prefer it a little more in the early game, even though you do technically get less shielding. This is also weak against Assassins because Assassins love when people spread out because they could pick units off in the backline all alone. But there are certain ways around that. For example, you could use stuff like Zizzirat Portal to kind of taunt the Assassins away, but well, we're getting a little off topic there. Next up, we have Featherweights. They're great for rerolls. So your 1 and 2 cost units gain movement speed and attack speed with Featherweights. And of course, you want to get this in the beginning because then you could commit to a hyper roll comp. So let's say you are going for a 1 cost carry or even a 2 cost carry and they like having attack speed, for example, like Kog'Maw, Tristana, units of that nature. You will want to know that you are going to force it if you get Featherweights early on in the game. This augment gets weaker later on because in the late game during stage 4, do you really care if your 1 and 2 cost units gain attack speed? Probably not, because you're probably not going to be going for one of those comps in that stage of the game. I'd say the absolute latest you want to take this augment is during the stage 3-3 armory, and that's only if you are already going for the comp and maybe you had a different sort of augment that helped you go for that reroll comp, such as some of the economy ones, which we'll get into later. Next up, we have First Aid Kit. This one, it gives all your healing and shielding received by your units increased by 35%. And as you guys could have guessed already, only take this if you have things that shield or heal. So obviously this is going to be great on units and synergies and items that shield and heal. So if you have a lot of that already, this is something that's useful to kind of augment that. So next up we have Item Grab Bag, and this one, it gives you 1 random completed item and a Reforger. And then at 2-star, it gives you 2 random items and 2 Reforgers. So I feel like this one is really broken in the early game because you just get a whole item above everyone else, and then if it sucks, you have a Reforger as well, and it allows you to gain direction during your game. I feel like it's personally really useful when I've gotten it, especially in the early game. As the game goes on, it's definitely still useful, but maybe not quite as powerful as some of the other augments, but it's still a very solid choice in my opinion. The only qualms I have about it is that it is random, which is why I do prefer it in the early game. But take this if you need combat strength, because getting an extra item can do a lot for your team. For example, if you're faced between a choice between Item Grab Bag and maybe like getting an additional synergy, say that additional synergy, you don't have quite the units to fit everyone in already, or you already have everyone 2-star, you can't quite reach the next threshold. Taking this Item Grab Bag is going to give you immediate power that you could put on your board right now to either save HP or to start a win streak. And that's why I think this is pretty decent. It's also good if you have like crappy items on your bench and you want to reforge those. Next up, we have Knife's Edge. This gives your team that starts in the front 2 rows at the start of combat a bunch of attack damage based on the level. And this is really good, obviously, if your team likes attack damage, and if you could play some up front. For example, Urgot's one of the guys that can go up front, Challengers can go up front, Assassins can go up front because they jump to the backline. Pretty much any low-range ADC is going to be working perfectly with this, with Knife's Edge. So what I do recommend though is don't force this on attack damage units where they don't want to be in the front line. For example, if you're playing Jhin, he's a sniper, don't put him on the front line just because you have this augment. The extra AD is not worth it. Only use this if you are already going to go on the front line, or if going in the front line doesn't affect them, such as a trait like Assassins. Next up, we have Makeshift Armor. So your units with no items gain 30 armor and magic resist. And this is good if you have too many damage items and like no tank items at all. So for example, we talked before about Fiora and Yone in a challenger comp. They're using 6 items. You don't get more than 6 items in a lot of games. So if you concentrate all your items on 2 carries, no one else has any items, well, Makeshift Armor is going to be really good for your team because it enhances everyone without an item. This is really bad if you have a lot of utility items. So pretty much whatever we learned from the cybernetic implants, do the opposite for that if you want to make Makeshift Armor work. I guess you gotta like make shift up. So in the early game, I'd say it's okay. Let's say you only have 3 units, you itemize 1 of them. You're really only getting the buff on 2 people. But as the game goes on, if you make great use of the buff, it's just gonna get more and more powerful. So next up, we have New Recruit. Your team just gains 1 size, and this is a great one if you already have a 2-star unit on your bench, or if you are 1 off a synergy and you have that unit on your bench as well, and you could just drop them in if you get an extra slot. It's going to be perfect for that. I feel like in the early game, that's the best time to get this because win streaking with a Force of Nature is really easy to do. Mid game, it's still good, but not as good as maybe some of the other augments at tier 3. And then in the late game, obviously pretty solid, because you have a lot of gold to find a extra 2-star unit to throw in. Next up, we have Phony Frontline. This is like the default choice for a lot of people because it's super flexible, but I recommend only taking it if you really need tanks, because what this augment allows you to do is skip some of your frontline units to play even more backline units. For example, if you're playing something like Snipers or Arcanists, something that goes deep into a tree but doesn't have any tanks in their synergy, you can just play Phony Frontline to take care of all your tanking needs. If you kill their tanks before they kill yours, nothing else is really going to matter after that. So if you have like a ton of damage and you don't have any tank items, like Phony Frontline is going to be a great choice for you. However, if you have a lot of tanks already, let's say you're going for a bodyguard build, or you have a lot of protectors, or all your bruisers are leveled up, it's going to be a pretty useless augment in my opinion. Next up, we have Portable Forge. Open an armory and choose 1 of 3 unique artifacts crafted by Ornn. This is really, really, really good, but it is a tier 3, which is why it sounds so good. But some of the Ornn items, you could get some crazy combinations that you can't get in any other game, because those are all super, super strong items. And if you take it early game, I feel like it's better because then again, you could get direction for your team. Whereas if you take it late game, there's a risk you run where you get something that's like not applicable at all. So do keep that in mind when you're taking Portable Forge. Next up, we have Stand United, 1, 2, 3. And your units gain attack damage and ability power per active trait across your team. So this is good if you have a lot of traits, and it does require a bit of planning. So this is great for all legendary teams because, as I said before, a lot of the legendaries have their own unique traits, such as like Tahm Kench, Yuumi, Jace, and others. So you gain extra bonuses for each of those traits for Stand United, which is great, right? So do the opposite of the other one we talked about before. I think it was called Build Different, where you want units to not have traits, but it's great if you're doing like kind of like a spread of everything. But again, this augment does require some planning, and I do think it does get better as the game goes on. Sunfire Board, this one, I have to assume it's always broken. You just like Sunfire everyone on the enemy team at the start of the game. I believe they just nerfed this, so the numbers here, I think it's like 30% instead of 40% of their max health, but it's great on teams that end fights quickly. So if you're playing Assassins, like they're going to be one-tapping a lot of things, and you're going to get the most use out of the Sunfire buff because they're not going to be able to heal up. But this is a great combat augment because it gives you immediate power and it will allow you to win streak really, really well. One thing to note, like don't build Sunfire or Morello if you're taking this item, obviously, because you already have the effect for free. Thrill of the Hunt 1, 2, 3. Your units heal 300, 450, and 600 health on kill, and this is great if you need sustain on some of your units. It's also good for comps that end fights early, because that's just how the mechanic works. If you kill people really quickly, you're gonna gain like the health like faster, and your units just will never die. Personally, I think it's slightly better in the early game. I might change this. Maybe it's like a 4-3-2 instead of like a 5-3-1. But early game fights snowball extremely hard. So if you do have a good team at the start of the game, definitely go for this. If you have a weak team, it's absolutely useless. So don't take this in the early game if you're not strong enough to kill any units. Titanic Force is the next one. Your units deal more than 1200 maximum health and gain attack damage equal to 4% of their max health. And this one's a 2-3-4 in my opinion. I think it does get better as the game goes on because in the beginning of the game, you don't have many units that do have more than 1200 max health. So you can't really take use of the buff and you can't even use it in a lot of cases. So definitely better as the game goes on. Great with high HP teams like bruisers, but like Warmogs and health items in general are going to be perfect for this type of team. Next up, we have underdogs. Whenever your team has fewer units alive than your opponent, your units regenerate 15% of their missing health every second. Oh, I wonder what that's going to be good on. Colossus, obviously, because you just have fewer units on the board innately, and they're just going to be healing a bunch of stuff. But like, yeah, if you rely on 1 or 2 units at the end of fights as well to like 1v5, it's also going to be great on them as well. Next up, we have Weak Spot. Oh yeah, also don't take this if you already have stuff like Phony Frontline, because I do believe those do count as units. So your opponent will need to kill more stuff before the buff kicks in. Next up, we have Weak Spot. Your units' attacks ignore their armor and also reduces the healing that they receive, the enemy receives. So you don't need Last Whisper anymore. If you're going attack damage comp, like obviously go for Weak Spot. Woodland Charm. At the start of combat, your highest health champion creates a 1500 health copy of himself, excluding items. Great in the early game. This is like the Woodland buff from, I believe, set 2. And Woodland is an early game trait, so what's better, having a 4v3 or a 10v9? I'd take a 4v3 any day of the week, so that's why it is typically better in the early game. Pandora's Box is next. Now we get into some of the other categories. Those were all the combat ones, or like purely combat augments, but now we're getting into like some of the scaling ones. Pandora's items gain a random component, and at the start of each and every turn, items on your bench are randomized except for Force of Nature, Spatula, and Consumables. Obviously, the more items you have, the more use you're going to get out of Pandora's items, but this is great for scaling into the late game. One thing to keep in mind is I don't like this in the actual late game because you don't have time to kind of fish for components. This is one of those where you're kind of just like scaling on into the late game rather than getting immediate power. The only time the immediate power does help is gaining the random component, but if you compare this to something like the item grab bag where you get a full item component, it's a lot worse because random component versus full item, it's easy to do the math there. But that's why I have this one categorized as like combat and scaling. Next up, we have Salvage Bin. Gain a random completed item. Selling champions breaks apart their full items into components, excluding Force of Nature. And this augment is only as strong as the player. This is a very high skill cap augment, and I do not recommend getting this unless you are big brain, very comfortable on the patch, or like you're a computer. Because imagine doing a huge roll down on like stage 4-1 or 5-1, you're rolling 50 gold, and then you need to make like 10 item components as well. Gonna be pretty difficult to do. We're only humans, but if you have really high APM, this is gonna be great for you. If you have terrible APM or like a pea-sized brain, or like a smooth brain, don't take Salvage Bin. But if you get it early enough, you could kind of manage and like do it piece by piece, in my opinion. But again, high risk, high reward, and it's just purely on how fast you click. One thing that is really good though is that you do gain a fully completed item, but this is a tier 2, so you kind of have to compete with all the other tier 2 augments. Next up, we have Calculated Loss. Man, this is a fun one. So if you are getting this in the early game, you can just grief every single round and do like a huge lose streak, because after losing your combat, you gain 2 gold and a free shop refresh. So imagine this on something like Yordles, where you're going for a reroll comp and you're going for a lose streak. You'll just have infinite gold from both rolling and from gaining 2 extra gold every single round. You just have to be careful and kind of cash out after a certain point and just stabilize your board and take use of all the gold that you already gained and then kind of forget about this augment later on. Next up, we have Clear Mind, and these are all the scaling augments that I have listed out here. And if you have no units on your bench at the end of a round, gain 4 experience points. This is great if you're doing like an open fort, and you could also take it if you have a lot of completed 2 stars already. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword where it's great if you don't have any units or you have like a very strong board already. Like it's kind of odd in that sense, but it is a little tricky to use. I think it is really good in the late game because what you can do in the late game is you're not really looking for anything. You 2-star everything and then you just gain 4 experience every turn to go to level 9. At least that's how I would think that this is going to be used. After that, we have Dominance. So after winning your combat, gain 1 bonus gold for every 2 surviving units. So you want to take this when you're win streaking, and you can often like tell when you're win streaking the easiest in the beginning of the game. Also, the gold matters more in the beginning of the game too. But you just have to make sure that you actually win by more than 2 units. So maybe it's not like a 5 at the start of the game. Maybe it's like a 4. But gaining even just 1 extra gold while win streaking in the early game is huge, because if you have a lot of 2 stars by the time you're on stage 1-4, you already know that you're going to be win streaking. And you also know that you're going to be winning by more than 2 units, because most people in the early game, if they don't have the right traits or 2 stars, you're going to be like 5-0ing them. So that's why I think this is good in the early game. Also, gold late game is kind of useless, so I don't really value it that highly. Do keep in mind this is a tier 1 augment, so it's not like super crazy stats that you're giving up by going for this type of augment. Next up, we have Level Up. When you buy experience points, gain an additional 4 experience points. Now you can reach level 10. Great for fast 8 or fast 9 comps and strategies. This is scaling for sure. This is also really insane in the early game because you are going to be able to reach level 5 really quickly, gain access to a lot of other units. Essentially, whenever you press F, you're going to be gaining 4 gold every time you do that. So we typically press F on stage 2-1, 2-5, and 3-2 in the early game at least. So right in stage 2, you gain 8 gold already because you're going to press F twice if you are part of that level up strategy. So you actually save a lot of gold when you're doing this. On stage 3-2, when you're reaching level 6, I believe it saves you like 2 rolls. So that's going to be an additional 8 gold there. Keep in mind, you're going to be getting a lot of other stuff as well. So there's just a lot of ways that this helps you scale into the late game because you get a ton of gold. That's why it's a tier 3 augment, because again, the way we're talking about it, it's giving like such amazing bonuses that it can't not be a tier 3 augment. I'm not really sure how to judge it for the mid to late game. I'll give it a 3 and a 3. March of Progress, gain 4 bonus experience points per round. You can no longer use gold to gain experience points. This is great for level 7 or 8 rerollers, because whenever you hit those levels, let's say you get it during stage 3-3, you're going to be able to kind of use all your gold to slow roll down to 50 every single turn. But once you hit your desired units, you could level up super fast and pretty much not miss a beat whenever you go for this augment. So if you take it during stage 3-3, probably going to be really good. Late game probably doesn't do that much, but it's good for hitting level 9, and early game probably not that great, but it does give you a big edge because you will be able to hit level 6 really quickly. You can even hit level 7 really quickly, but it just like is going to take a long time to hit level 8 and level 9. You probably just won't ever reach level 9 if you take this in, but in the early game, actually, now that I'm thinking about it again, it's probably not that bad if you're trying to win streak, because you just gain 4 gold every single round. And you just never have to buy experience again. And for a tier 2, that's honestly not too bad. Metabolic Accelerator. Your tactician moves faster and heals 2 health at the start of each round. Great for open forting in my opinion. Pretty useless in the late game because health doesn't really mean much then. And it's also good if you're spiked mid game and are low HP. For example, if you do a full lose streak during stage 2 and then you stabilize on stage 3-2 on a level 6 roll down, and then next turn you get your augment and you're like, oh, Metabolic Accelerator, perfect. I'm at 50 health. I'm just gonna heal all the way back up because I spiked my team at level 6 on stage 3-2. That's the situations where I think this is really good. Obviously, garbage late game, don't take it then. Trade Sector, gain a shop refresh each round. This is great for reroll comps. Essentially, like, it's the dream. You get a free reroll every single round. So the earlier you get it, the better. The later you get it, the more trash it is, because who cares about a free reroll in the later parts of the game, because gold is worth much more at the beginning. Wise spending, this one is gain 1 experience point whenever you refresh your shop. This happens a lot more often than you think. So no one uses it early game, because early game, you just don't press the D button that much. Mid game, it's amazing because you're going to be re-rolling on maybe you stabilize at 3-5, 4-1, 4-2, 4-3, maybe even 5-1. But taking it on 4-6, I feel like is a little late because again, gold is worth less as you move on into the game. But I guess it's not completely useless. Maybe I'll give it a 2 instead of a 1. Golden ticket. Now we're into the scaling and spiking one. So spiking is great for like big roll down. So scaling, it's more for like getting strength throughout the course of the game. Combat is just constant, like immediate bonus right away, but kind of flat. And then spiking is like super hard spike. Right here, right now, you need some power. Let's go. You'll see what I mean in a moment. So golden ticket. Each time your shop is refreshed, you have a 35% chance to gain a free refresh. So this is good if you're gonna roll down on stage like 3-5 if you get it on 3-3. So 3-3 is the round before the carousel, 3-5 is the one after that. So if you're doing like a fast 7 on 3-5, and then you're gonna roll like 20 to 30 gold, you could do that now because you gain a lot of free refreshes. So you're gonna be able to 2-star a lot of stuff on your board. If you take it during like the late game, it still might be useful then because you're going to be spiking on stage 5-1, so you could use it almost immediately and get pretty much a guarantee of 2-starring whatever 4 cost you're looking for. But this is great for like fast 8 comps in that sense, and also good for reroll because, well, like in reroll, you want as many rolls as possible, and this is great for getting that. High-end shopping is the next one, so champions appear in your shop as if you were 1 level higher. This one is great because, I mean, you just get access to better champions. So if you have a reroll comp that kind of stabilizes on level 7, but you want to reroll on level 6 because you're going for 2 stars. This is the perfect augment for those types of builds because then you don't have to do half and half where you like level up to the next level but still roll down for your other unit that is more optimal on lower levels. A comp that can relate to this, I believe, is like the Kled reroll comp in set 5.5 because Kled was great because you rerolled for him on level 5 and then you wanted Kennen afterwards and you want to reroll for Kennen at level 6. However, you want to get to level 7 to have 7 units on the board for specific synergies and you just weren't allowed to do that because this augment didn't exist. So if you don't, so you had to make a choice between going for Kennen 3 at level 6 or going to level 7 to make sure that your board is stronger. But high-end shopping fixes that problem for some of those comps. We don't know if they exist yet, but if they do, gonna be great for that. Next up, hyper roll. If you have less than 10 gold at the end of your round, you gain bonus gold. I believe they changed this to 2 instead of 3 now. By the way, guys, I'm going to be updating this and like updating all the descriptions. I'm having my friend write a code to do it. So once that happens, it will be updated by the time you guys see this. Essentially, you want to take this when you're about to roll down or go all in. So if you take this during the mid game, it's great because you could go for a power spike during stage 3-5. As we talked about before, it's like similar to golden ticket, or in the late game, you do a 5-1 roll down and then you just gain like 2 bonus gold per turn, which is essentially the same as having 20 gold worth of interest. So you want to take this whenever you are about to perform a roll down. So in the later parts of the game, I feel like that is more worth it. In the beginning, it's kind of weird because you don't want to roll too much on the early levels. So it is a little awkward to take in the early game, at least in my opinion. Next up is Rich Get Richer. You gain 10 gold and your maximum interest is increased to 7. So you could have 70 gold and collect all the interest from that. Pretty good in the early game because as you guys know, compound interest, the more interest you get early, the more you get later. So it's pretty good in the early game. In the mid game, this is probably where it shines because you probably have 50 gold at that point. Taking this brings you to 60 and then you get to 70 essentially in the next turn. And then you could perform a big roll down, maybe on like stage 4-5 for like a fast 8 with like 75 gold in the roll down or something like that, something ridiculous. But it's something you could aim for. In the late game, useless because you're never going to be at 70 HP after stage 4-6 unless you already won the game. In which case, taking any augment would help you win the game anyways. Next up, we have Windfall. This is the last scaling / spiking one, but you just gain gold based on the amount of augments that you currently have. And great if you need that gold to either catch up in econ. So if you rolled on 3-2 stabilized at level 6, it's going to be decent in the mid game for that. It's also good if you plan to go to level 7 on 3-5. But if you need immediate gold either to get interest or to roll down, gonna be great for you. So in the early game, probably really good in the early game because like you just scale off of all the interest, but it's a tier 3, so that's a little hard to judge too. But I'll probably give it a 4, maybe a 3, and kind of a 3 like that. But yeah, if you need to roll, take it. If you need econ, take it. Depends on what you want to do. And then there's only one pure spiking one. This one's called High Roller. This one gives you 2 loaded dice. So if you are close to getting a 3-star, take High Roller and then use loaded dice to look for whatever unit you're looking for. Unfortunately, this is the only purely spiking one that I've seen. The rest of them were like scaling / spiking. Now we get into the traits. So these are a little interesting because the trait ones, you either gain an emblem, your team counts as having an additional of whatever trait it is, or it's like a little buff. So if we scroll down a little bit, for example, I separated out all the pure trait ones with the trait / combat ones. So essentially all the trait ones, it's pretty self-explanatory. If you're going for a team comp with one of those traits, it's gonna be good. If you aren't, it's gonna be bad. So we're able to skip like 50 augments just like that. But where it gets interesting is the trait / combat ones, because these give combat bonuses for your team. But again, the decision making around it, very, very easy. Are you going for one of these traits? If so, probably want to take it. One thing to keep in mind though is that the more deep you are into a trait, the more of these bonuses that you take advantage of. For example, if we look at the Chemtech one, Chemtech Overload, Chemtechs explode on death, dealing 100% of their max health as magic damage to enemies within 2 hexes. If you're only running 3 Chemtech, probably not worth it. If you're running 5 or 7, obviously it's going to be a lot better. So a lot of these you want to go if you go deep into a trait, if you go for like the big vertical synergies. But if you're just using them as like a splash trait, probably not going to be that worth it. But you guys can read through all of these here. I have them all listed out. I'm going to be adding more notes to them as I play the game. So you guys will have access to that all on my website at bunnymuffins.lol/augments. Just to summarize, during the early game in your first carousel, you probably want to pick something that either fits with your board. So if you have a strong board, pick one of the win streaking augments. If you're a little weak, you could look into getting some of the scaling ones. And if you're going for a specific trait, or if you're forcing a comp and one of the trait augments come up, go ahead and take those. In the mid game, you need to evaluate again the same thing. Do you need tanks? If so, you could get stuff like Phony Frontline or anything that makes you more tanky. If you are on a win streak, you might want to take one of the combat augments. And again, if you're lose streaking or plan on lose streaking or have a lot of health to kind of allow you to scale up, some of the scaling ones might be useful there. And then of course, in the late game, you're going to want to take whatever is best for your team at that specific time. You can kind of think of it like building certain items. If you have a lot of damage already, take something that's going to make your team more tanky or give you some utility. If you have a lot of tanks, get something that will give you more damage. Your choices between augments are going to vary between game to game very greatly, and that's kind of what they purposely made this set do. But hopefully this video has helped you categorize and kind of understand what each and every augment kind of does. If you guys have like suggestions on different types of categories, do let me know down in the comments below. But I'm going to be updating this throughout the set. I feel like it's pretty interesting to do, and yeah, hopefully this helps you guys make your decisions on which augments to take during each round of the game, or like whenever they pop up. But if you guys are interested in more TFT content like this, make sure to subscribe below. And also check out my TFT website, bunnymuffins.lol, because I'm going to be making a lot of Set 6 updates to it, and I come out with a tier list every single Friday, both on the website and on this YouTube channel. So I hope to see you guys there. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to share and subscribe, and of course smash that like button. Each like is an LP I gain before the next video.